Hello, everybody. I'm Abby Hayes, the practice leader of diversity, equity, and inclusion engagement at W2O. I am really excited to be here with you all today, moderating our panel on patient-centricity in reducing healthcare inequality. I'm joined by three powerhouses in health equity today. Mary Michael, Vice President of Patient Advocacy and Stakeholder Management at Otsuka. Mary is a healthcare industry leader who is truly skilled and well-versed in taking social insights and converting them into practical action, connecting dots where dots often aren't connected. Mary Stutz, Senior Vice President of Corporate Relations at Sumitomo Biopharm. Mary is a well-known thought leader when it comes to cultural competency and building that competency within work environments. And she's also championed health equities across a range of different verticals in her career, from oncology to her recent work at Stanford. And then Anya Harry, Global Head of Demographics and Diversity at GlaxoSmithKline. Anya has spent years practicing pulmonary and critical care medicine, and she's also an expert in public health, having worked at the FDA. In the 25 minutes that I have with you all today, my hope is that you're going to walk away with a better understanding of how we can truly, in pharma and biotech, help close the health equity gap. From meeting people where they are, from truly addressing the needs of the communities that are around us, and then last but not least, making sure that we're culturally attuned to the audiences that we want to engage, pulling through their lived experience where appropriate. The urgency of this is so important to us today because we are living through the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and racism. The front row seat that we've had to the healthcare inequities that face us today have truly challenged what patient-centricity really means in our industry, and really truly has opened the door for new and better ways of engaging the people around us. So Mary Michael, I'm going to turn to you first. We know that the healthcare inequities that we're facing in our industry are deeply rooted, but those inequities really truly have not only shown us that people are being left behind, but there's some key issues that we need to address in terms of how we're giving people the information that they need to make informed health decisions, but also truly navigate the different experiences that they're having. Tell me a little bit from your perspective what some of the key issues there are that we need to address.
Well, Abby, you pointed to COVID-19, which I think has exposed a lot of great things about our healthcare system, but also some major gaps that we have just as a healthcare community, if you will, and the system. And, I think it's very important that we communicate to make sure that the language that we use really resonates with everybody and not just those who might be, scientifically minded or educated. And I think that we've seen that not only with the just the general information about COVID-19, but quite frankly, even the platforms, the various platforms that the vaccinations are based on, so that people can make informed decisions. And I think that we have an obligation to our constituencies, whoever we are and whoever they might be, to make this information easily understandable and digestible so that they can make informed decisions. So, you mentioned that I do a lot of social listening and take a lot of those insights. Well, I think that any of us who are making materials for the consumer at large really needs to pay attention to that language and the lexicons that's being used to make sure that the message really resonates and is received, appropriately by that audience.
So Mary Stutz, knowing everything that you've done in terms of building cultural competency, but also working with institutions like Stanford when it comes to truly bringing your communities along and bringing them with you in this journey towards health equity. Tell us a little bit about the importance of cultural intelligence in terms of making those informed decisions.
Absolutely. The truth be told, there is a fear of diverse people and them being able to participate in conversations with healthcare organizations. That's just reality, especially academic medical organizations, unfortunately. So this fear of the diversity of discipline and professions is causing a real problem with our ability to move forward. So, doing things, and the academic institutions, medical institutions are so important to being able to advance and move beyond and move this whole health disparities needle. So, having to do things like encouraging the medical faculty to create these diverse groups when they're creating their committees. Unfortunately, they always want to pick someone who's a lawyer or who's an MD instead of the school teacher or the community nonprofit employee who can provide experience that can really enrich the studies and the work that's happening. These are folks who are immersed in every aspect of the community, not just the medical aspect. That's what we mean by immersing yourself in the culture and understanding the culture. So talk to other people. And then, the other challenge is trying to make people comfortable with the uncomfortableness of diversity and engagement. These can be uncomfortable conversations. That's why we need more physicians of color. We certainly need more Black males. The Black males in medical school has declined from 10% several years ago to only 5%. People need to see folks who look like them. But until we get to that point, there's got to be this, what I call inclusion immersion, that needs to happen in order to really help our medical communities understand and connect with our diverse populations. We're not just talking about training. This is not a one and done. So that's why you will rarely hear me use the word training, because it's about immersion into the cultures and gaining that cultural understanding and empathy and humility, especially for our non-diverse physicians and nurses, especially for those working in, for example, emergency departments. From my work that I've done and research I've done, that's where a lot of the people of color have their initial interactions with healthcare organizations. And unfortunately, it's not always positive. So you have to pay attention to how you're developing your non-diverse staff when they come from non-diverse communities and backgrounds. How are you helping them get acculturated so that they can do their work and they're not afraid of people coming in? I would say the last thing is really helping researchers and faculty who really want to understand how we engage communities. So they have to understand the importance of building meaningful relationships on the front end, not just when you're ready to launch your therapy or get your trial enrolled, but build those meaningful relationships on the front end. Listen to people when you're designing and listen to a diversity of skill sets and experiences, and then involve those folks when building and collaborating. There's a lot of arrogance on our part when we deal with communities of color that immediately assume that they are not as intelligent or they won't understand what we're trying to say and trying to explain and what the need is, and it's very insulting and disrespectful. So understanding that and coming from this different approach of listening to people, valuing them, respecting them, involving them, letting them know that you believe they can help with this building and collaborating and address these needs.
Mary, you raised some really important points around not only the need for immersion, right, but also around listening and connecting. And a lot of those points, I think, are important not only in terms of when people actually go into a place for a point of care, be it the emergency room or a doctor's office, but that there's also connectivity with that when it comes to how we engage communities in terms of the overall research experience, right? Because when you think of the patient journey, it starts when you're actually investigating medicines in the lab through obviously approval and beyond. So in thinking of Anya and her work when it comes to clinical trial diversity, I think a lot of what you said around culture, that lived experience, truly being immersed and attuned is important. Anya, tell me a little bit from your perspective in terms of how those principles come into play with the work that you do to make sure that when we get clinical trial data, it's reflective of the populations around us and important in terms of making medical decisions.
I think culture is really the key issue here. And what we try to do at GlaxoSmithKline is make sure that we understand the cultural challenges of the patient, make sure that we understand the language barriers, and we're trying to make sure that we include individuals that speak the various languages so that, again, we're coming to where the patient is, what matters to the patient, and hopefully by us understanding all of these cultural issues, we can understand and take that into consideration for the moments that matter along the clinical trial journey, right? So whether it's conferences, patient panels, what I found often is that people feel like they're not heard. People feel like they're not seen, right? People feel like they don't matter. And this is such a critical issue because we're developing the armamentarium for our doctors and nurses and healthcare practitioners in general in order to treat people, right? And usually we're treating individuals at the most critical point in their life when they either have a disease or we're trying to prevent a disease. So we try to incorporate this when we're designing our clinical trials. We try to incorporate this when we're understanding, well, what's the burden of the protocol? And again, all of this is in order to make sure that we truly understand the challenges of these different individuals. I think that this is a critical time with the pandemic because it really highlights these disparities. And I know we'll get more into it, but culture is key. And let me just say one other thing. It's for us, it's not just the culture of the patient, but it's actually the culture of our organization. I need to make sure that our staff understands the value of this data, the importance of having the completeness of this data in order to make sure that we're developing our molecules in the best way possible, and that we're including information in the prescribing leaflet so that physicians and nurses know how to use our medicines and vaccines. So in order to do that, I need to make sure that we're bringing inclusive research within the culture of GSK, and this is something that we're doing as well. So it's not just an issue of the challenges around the culture of our patients and our consumers, but it's making sure that the culture within GSK embraces this and that this is a priority.
Thank you for that, Anya, and for my other panelists. I mean, in listening to you all, there are a few things that come to mind for me. One, the fact that there's a lot of work ahead of us, and a lot of it seems to be extremely daunting. The other point that I wanted to say was, a lot of this, I'm sure, isn't new to you here on this panel, and probably isn't new to others who've been working in this space for a very long time. Because essentially, I mean, everyone now says we have had an awakening, but it's almost like a reawakening to the things that we know have festered for a really long time. So I say all of that to say, it sounds as if there's a whole lot ahead of us that might be quite daunting. But from your perspective, though, on the flip side, what actually do you think gives you hope and optimism based on where we are today?
Well, the optimism is that we're having some great conversation. We're having candid conversations. I think that we're not skirting around, the issues that we really need to kind of look at together jointly and then address them and then come up with some solutions. And I think that, especially in this virtuality that we're living in these days, it actually gives us an opportunity to connect even more so than we might have previously. There's not the logistics of travel. So we can get together and have this lovely conversation. We can have so many more of these where we can inspire one another, we can educate one another, and we can learn from one another so that we can, as a collective, make some moves towards really bridging that gap. And I think in a meaningful way, as opposed to maybe in the previous, in the past, when I've had different roles, it's been about like, well, make sure you meet the minimum standards, right? Now I think it's about what's the optimal standard so that we can optimize care, so that people can access care, so that they really optimize their wellness, right? It's not about sickness.
Great, Mary Stutz. I know that you were going to jump in, so feel free.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I'm most encouraged that despite its horror, COVID-19 has actually elevated disparities to a national discourse now, and it has gotten the attention of all of the stakeholders because, you know, and so the reason why that's good is because there's always been this kind of hidden, I think, feeling that people with health disparities, it's kind of their own fault for whatever reason, and it's not a real thing. But this pandemic and seeing the disparities that is being experienced by people. So, you know, Black Medicare beneficiaries are 4 times more likely to be hospitalized with COVID-19. 35% of the Black population lives in highly vulnerable testing deserts where they can't even get the test. You know, there's like one site per 14,500 people for testing for in white communities, whereas there's one site per 23,300 people in the African American communities. And there are more disparities there, and certainly the high death rates and all of these things that are drawing attention to. There are some real systemic underlying causes for health disparities that we all better get together and figure out, because it is impacting our whole world. This is now not just this group of people, this population that folks are skeptical about whether it's their fault or if there are really systemic issues. And now we see there are truly systemic issues, and people are dying at a more rapid rate. And so everybody's coming together, because in the long run, we've got to figure out how to address COVID-19, because it's not the last pandemic that we're going to see. And even it won't go away. It keeps evolving and coming up with variants. And so to me, that is one of the things, if you look, you know, that I'm optimistic about as well, is that at least everyone is getting on the same page that health disparities are real, and all of the stakeholders have got to come together to deal with it.
Great. Anya, do you want to have the last word on the optimism point?
I am optimistic, and I think a lot of that optimism has come from watching the pharmaceutical industry actually come together during this pandemic period. But I think to more fully understand this issue, I think it helps us to, it would be helpful to go over where we've been. So back in 1999, that's when I graduated from med school, and I had the opportunity to have our keynote speaker, Dr. David Satcher. And during that speech, he talked about healthcare disparities, right? And then our role of what we should be considering to do with our career in order to address them. And, you know, when I look now over the course of that little over 20 years, some areas we've improved, some areas the numbers are the same, and some areas, unfortunately, they're actually worse. So what makes me optimistic despite that is because even during that short period of 1 year with this pandemic, again, the pharmaceutical industry has joined together in a non-competitive manner to share best practices, to share training, to share approaches in order to make sure that our clinical trials have the diverse representation. And that's so different than before. And we actually see the evidence because we see many of the pharmaceutical vaccines, the vaccines that have been developed, actually having populations more representative of those with the disease in such a short period of time. So that brings me to an optimistic point. And you know, let's now the issue is, can we continue this? Can sustainable approach, right? So that's what brings me actually to a point where I'm optimistic.
So speaking of optimism and what, the future could look like, the last kind of lightning round question is, if you were to look into your crystal ball, right, and think of where you think we'd be 5 years from now, what does that look like? And Anya, I'll start with you if you want to put a coda on the point that you just made before we go to the other panelists.
Sure. What it would look like is to see these trends of these gaps decreasing over the period of the 5 years, right? In 1 year, we were able to develop a vaccine and the populations in those clinical trials were very representative. So we can do this. So I think now we need to ride with the urgency of this pandemic to make sure that many of these most critical areas where there are huge gaps between these subgroups in the outcomes of the diseases begin to narrow. So 5 years, I think, is a fair amount of time to aspire to see the decreasing in those trends, in those numbers.
Yeah, I am hopeful that we will have made, as Anya said, tremendous progress in delivering equitable care to all populations, and that we'll see it in things not only like COVID-19, but in other great disparities like, hopefully we'll see a decline of the maternal and infant mortality rate among Black women, which is the highest of any women in the world, any ethnicity, no matter what's their geographic location, their socioeconomic status, whether they're married or single, their education levels, doesn't matter. Black women and Black babies are not surviving the birthing process more than any other women. So things like that, where hopefully we will have made some true progress in addressing these disparities. And that my other hope is that trust will be not restored, because they don't have it, but that it will actually be created in our healthcare system and our research programs, such that the Human Genome Database reflects the diversity of our population. So that's another piece that I have been very focused on since leading the diversity in clinical trials effort at Genentech, which has now evolved into diversifying the Human Genome Database. And until we can get everyone's genomic data represented in the Human Genome Database, we are never going to really achieve the level of health and wellness that we all want to see in the world, literally. So that is why my second hope in 5 years is that trust will have been created, and hopefully using the process, building upon the success that we're starting to see with how folks are coming together to address COVID-19 and finding space for each other and listening to each other and trying to learn. And hopefully that'll be a great foundation then for us to move on and address some of these other disparities.
Yeah, I think that what we've learned is that when we were first hit by this pandemic, that we were able to lift some barriers to access to care through telemedicine. So I'm hopeful that we will rely on some digital technologies, maybe that exist today, but maybe aren't in existence yet, to make sure that access is available to everybody, regardless of where they are.
Excellent. Well, those I think are some very both insightful, but I think very practical and actionable kind of outcomes, if you will, looking for future forward. So really appreciate you all coming together with me today to have this conversation. And I think we would have left our listeners and viewers with some really useful actions that they can take moving forward. And very, very pleased to have you all here with me today. Thank you so much.